Hi there, it's Miss Tiffany from the Butler Area Public Library, and I'm here with another Library 101 video. Library 101 is a series where I help you learn more about the Butler Area Public Library, about libraries in general, and about information literacy. Today, we are going to talk about how to do basic research. So, what is research? Well, as this quote by Dan Brown suggests, research is not just going to Google. Research is where you do a thoughtful and careful and organized study about a specific topic. You organize information from various sources and you organize it in a way that presents the information according to a thesis that you have put forth. So, how do you begin a research project? Well, it's always good to start with the topic. Usually when you're doing research, it's because you've been given an assignment or you have a specific area of interest that you want to look into further. And that would be your topic. So when you're thinking about your topic, what is the main question you have about this topic? It's always good to choose something that you're interested in, even if it is to fulfill an assignment. You want to think about why the research is being done. Now, obviously, if you're doing an assignment, that is a big part of your why, but why that specific topic? You could have picked any for your assignment. Why did you pick that? What is it that you want to know? What do you want to do to add to the wealth of information already out there about this topic? You want to take that main question that you have and break it down into different parts, like subtopics or sub-questions. By looking into those subtopics or answering those sub-questions, it will help you better organize the information to answer the overall main question. So I told you that the purpose of research is to gather information and synthesize it in a way that supports your thesis. What is a thesis? Well, a thesis is a statement of what the research is going to cover. A lot of times when you're doing research for an assignment, you have to submit a research proposal or a thesis statement to your instructor. This is to help keep you on the right track when you're doing your research. You want to keep in mind the timeline, the scope, the length of the output of the research. Again, a lot of these things have to do with if you've been given an assignment. So for example, if your assignment is to write a 10-page research paper, you don't want to have 100 different resources that you're pulling from. That's going to be way too much information for such a short scope of research. However, if someone were doing a doctoral thesis, they may have hundreds of resources depending on what their topic is. So again, you want to keep in mind what is your specific assignment or your specific purpose for your research. Are there guidelines for how long it needs to be, how many sources you need to have, what kinds of sources you need to have, what is your final product, what is it going to look like? That's going to help you narrow down the scope of your research. So for example, one of the local schools every year has a class do a research project on any historical event that has happened since the 1960s. As you can imagine, that is over 50 years worth of history to cover, and there are many things that you could pick as your topic. So let's say you wanted to do something based on the Vietnam War. Well, even the Vietnam War is so incredibly broad of a topic that, let's say you were writing a 10-page research paper, it would be nearly impossible to do thorough research on the Vietnam War just in 10 pages. So you want to keep your scope in mind. So let's say that you had that 10-page restriction on a history topic since the 1960s and you wanted to focus on the Vietnam War. You could narrow that down perhaps to American public reaction to our entrance into the Vietnam War. So you can see that that has already narrowed the scope quite a bit. That will help keep you on track to meet the outlined assignment. So if you have a topic and you have your thesis statement, the next thing you're going to want to do is start finding resources. This is where the rubber hits the road in terms of research. It's always a good idea to start on the internet because that's typically what students have the easiest access to. And of course, when people start on the internet, they usually go to some place like Google. Google is a fine starting place. However, keep in mind, Google covers the whole internet, and anyone can put whatever they want on the internet. So, in order to make sure that your resources are really scholarly and valid, you may want to use a sub area of Google called Google Scholar. Google Scholar focuses on vetted and peer reviewed. That means it is factual and there is someone backing up the quality of that information. It's always a good idea when you are using the internet to pay attention to the kinds of websites you are using for your sources. Of course, with a .com type website, again, anybody can put that out there. It's always a good idea to stick to websites that are also vetted by some organization or entity. These would be things like government websites, educational websites, scientific organizations. So again, let's take our example of the American perception of our entry into the Vietnam War. If that was our topic, then maybe the Smithsonian websites would be a good place to get some information, as well as other government archive websites. When you're gathering information from websites, you want to make sure that you are collecting some information that you will need for your bibliography. You want to make sure that you are getting the full URL from the website. If there is a name attached to who authored the particular article or page that you are using, you want to take that, as well as the title of the page, the date that it was published, or if there is no published date, the date that you have accessed it. So you've started with the internet, which is always a good place to start. But where do you go next? Well, next, I would suggest you go to your library, whether that is your school library or your public library, a local college library, such as BC3 for us here in Butler. Not only are there going to be more vetted materials there that you will be able to find in terms of newspaper articles, archives, databases, books, DVDs. There's also library staff like me who are there to help assist you with your research. They can help you narrow it down. They can help you use tools that you may be less familiar with, such as databases, and they can even help you track down information that might not be available in that specific library, but instead through other libraries, through things like interlibrary loan. Sometimes you will want first-person information for your research. If that is the case, you want to make sure that you leave plenty of time to set up and perform interviews. This would be with someone who is a professional in the area, someone who is a witness to the event, or someone that is an expert in the field. So let's say, again, you are doing that paper on the American public perception of our entry into the Vietnam War. You may want to talk to a college professor that specializes in that area of history. Or you may want to talk to a veteran about what their experience was when they went to Vietnam and when they came back. So you've been gathering lots of information so far through the research process. The next thing you want to do is refine your search. This all goes back to that thesis. What is your main question? How are you going to answer it? How are you going to present that information? And what are the subtopics or sub-questions that you are going to cover in order to get that main question answered? These sub-questions will help narrow down your research or refine your research as well. So we talked a little bit about the types of sources that you find on the internet and how you have to be careful because you want to evaluate whether they are valid or not. Another thing you need to do when you're evaluating your sources is to decide whether a resource is a primary resource or a secondary resource. So a primary resource is something that presents direct evidence or artifacts or documents from the original people involved in the action or the topic or the situation. Again, using our Vietnam War and America's perception of our entry into it as a topic, you would want to go back and look at original newspaper articles, magazine articles, interviews done with people at the time that the US was entering the Vietnam War to get primary sources. You might want to look at photographs of things like war protests. You may, again, want to talk to veterans about what their experience was. These would all be primary resources. Sometimes primary resources are difficult to find depending on what your topic is. You do want to try to find some. However, if you can't find enough to be the bulk of your research, you can use secondary sources. A secondary source is where another person has looked at primary resources, consolidated that information, and presented it, typically in the form of a book or a research paper. If you find good secondary sources, but you would like to see the primary sources, you can always look at the bibliography of the secondary source. So if you have a book about the Vietnam War, you could go into the bibliography, see what some of their primary resources were, and try to find those as well. Typically in research, preference is given to sources that have been printed in the form of books or in journals or newspaper articles. As the world continues to move faster and become more electronically advanced, a lot of times those things aren't in physical print form. They may be in electronic print form and found on the web, but they're still considered print materials. And the reason is because, again, there is oversight. Someone has vetted the information in those materials. So even if you're using something like an e-journal or an e-book, that's still considered published in print because there's been oversight to that information. These types of resources are considered better or more thorough than just a random website where you may have found information. You also want to make sure that you don't have tunnel vision when it comes to your topic. You want to make sure that you are finding information with both sides of the thesis covered, the side that supports it and the side that argues against it. This will give a more well-rounded researched product. So you've gathered information, you've vetted some primary sources as well as secondary sources, and you should be taking notes when you go through all of this research. The more notes you take, the easier it is to organize the information when it comes time to synthesize the research paper. Again, make sure that you are documenting page numbers, the name of the source, the author of the source, the publication information, whether that is in print or on the internet. And you want to make sure that you keep all of your research together. Typically, what I do is I use the index card method, where I make an index card for every resource I'm using and I assign a number. Then I take notes on each resource and use the same corresponding number. For example, if I'm using a magazine article, that might be number 1, and all of the notes that I take from that are labeled number 1. And then if I use a book, that may be number 2, and all of the notes I take from the book would be labeled number 2. Then when I go to put the information together based on topic, I never have to wonder, where did I get this information from? Because it's always right there in my notes. I got this from the magazine article. I got this from the book. It's a good idea to keep an outline as you're going along. This can really easily be achieved by what are those subtopics or sub-questions that you need to cover in order to get your main question or thesis covered. That kind of helps things flow into a natural outline. When you work from an outline, it is much easier to organize all of the notes that you're going to have in a logical way. Research is something that does take a lot of time, and you don't want to have to rush it. You do want to allow yourself plenty of time because you're going to need to take a break. Eventually, after you've done so much research on a topic, you can get a little tired of it. So it's a good idea to walk away for a little bit, do something else, and then come back to it with a new viewpoint. So you have created your thesis statement and broken that down into subtopics that you need to cover. You've done lots of research, you've taken lots of notes, you've noted all of your sources, and now it's time to start the writing process. You want to take those notes and organize them in a way that fills out your outline. This is why I really like using index cards. If I put each main idea on an index card, I can easily lay them out in a way that really fills out my outline, and the writing kind of does itself. So you write your first draft of the research paper. This is where you get your ideas on paper and you make sure that you're covering all of the topics you want to. Basically, you just want to put it out there. It doesn't have to be pretty, it just has to be done. Once you have that first draft done, though, you want to really take some time and reread that draft. You want to go over it and see, are there any obvious spelling or grammar errors? You want to make sure that your facts are correct. You want to make sure that all of your sub questions are answered or your subtopics are covered to support your main thesis. You want to make sure that it follows your outline so that it is organized. And then you want to rewrite based on any corrections you've made to that first draft. This will be your second draft. Sometimes you only need 2, sometimes you need more than that. But you definitely want to have at least 2 drafts of your paper. Each time you do research, it's going to look different from the last time you've done research. Typically, these are done for school assignments, and your teacher may have very specific steps that they want you to follow throughout the research process. So, for example, you may be required to turn in a first draft that is totally uncorrected. The instructor may correct it or give you suggestions and have you submit a second draft and go through that process again before you submit a final. Your instructor may want you to turn in your outline. You may have deadlines that you have to meet along the way. This is just a general overview of how to do some basic research for a research paper. So back at the beginning of my presentation, I recommended that you use your library as a resource. And I said, of course, we've got books and we have other materials like microfilm, a microfiche, DVDs, access to interlibrary loans. But the biggest resource at your library, whether it's your school library, your public library, or a university library in your area, is the library staff. We can help you learn how to use resources that you may not be familiar with or you may not have thought of, but we can also help you keep on track during the research process in general. If you are a patron of the Butler Area Public Library, we can even point you to some outside resources to help with things like that first draft. For example, we have a service called tutor.com where you can submit a paper for someone to review it, which can be really helpful when you're doing research. One of the things I mentioned is after so long, you get sick of seeing the same topic, your eyes might get a little crossed, and you may not find your own mistakes. But if you hand it off to an outside source, they may help keep you in line a little bit easier. This has been a general overview of how to do the research process. If you need help with any of your research or you have any other library related questions, please feel free to reach out to me. My contact information is in the description of this video. Thank you so much for watching and happy reading and researching.